For as long as wars have existed, old men have had to convince young men to fight them. First it was influential speeches, then posters, then radio and film. Today, it's video games. And with Russia's so-called 3-day special military operation, now dragging onto its 4th year, Russia's need for young recruits has only grown. One response to that is a video game called Squad 22 Zov, a cheap ripoff aimed squarely at teenagers, designed to sanitize and sell the Russian Ukrainian war, while claiming to present history as it is. So today, I'm going to play it, so you don't have to. Squad 22 Zov, released May 28, 2025, is a top-down tactical strategy game that claims to depict the real wartime experience of Russian veterans fighting in Ukraine. It was developed by SPN Studio and published by Zarabana Entertainment, two companies that have never released another game besides Squad 22. One of the few positives here is that the game is free. That means I don't have to spend money on something where it's unclear whether the proceeds might indirectly support the war itself, something I'll come back to later. But from the moment you start the game, it's obvious how little effort went into it. Just listen to the music. The artwork doesn't fare much better. The developers openly admit they use AI to generate the 2D images before having artists draw them over to make them feel more genuine, but the end result still looks uncanny and unfinished. Overall, the UI feels like a 2005 Flash game you'd find on Congregate, and honestly that tracks for a game that couldn't even come up with an original name, seemingly lifting it from another title, Squad 44. And speaking of stealing ideas, once you reach the tutorial it becomes clear that Squad 22 is essentially a Russian clone of Door Kickers. Both games revolve around pausing the action to plan for how your soldiers clear the buildings. The tutorial itself is extremely basic, covering only the most fundamental controls, but the lack of polish becomes obviously clear when you compare it to the game it's copying. In Door Kickers, your character automatically adapts, crouching, crawling, or adjusting movement as needed. Here you have to command every action, going over or under an obstacle, which makes the controls feel clunky and outdated. The tutorial ends with you destroying a Hind helicopter in what might be the lowest quality explosion I've ever seen in a modern game. After the tutorial, the game drops you into its first operation, the Battle of Mariupol in 2022. One of the earliest and most destructive battles of the war. The Battle of Mariupol was defined by near total devastation. Roughly 95% of the city was destroyed by sustained Russian bombardment. Thousands of civilians were killed, and Ukrainian forces held out until they're completely surrounded and out of supplies. None of that context meaningfully exists in the game. Before starting the mission, you're asked to select 3 soldiers, each with their own stats and backstory. One of them, Private Mikhail, is described as a man with a soft spot, someone who ensures every last civilian is evacuated from danger zones. But this framing becomes deeply uncomfortable when you find out that Mariupol is estimated to have seen around 25,000 civilian deaths. It was also the site of repeated failed Red Cross evacuation corridors, many of which were shelled before civilians could escape by Russians. There are documented reports of mass graves, looting, sexual violence, and blocked humanitarian aid. None of that aligns with the image of a soldier whose defining trait is protecting civilians, yet that is exactly how the game wants you to feel. And this is really the core of the problem. The issue here isn't bad gameplay, and it isn't even the fact that it's a recruiting tool. Plenty of games have done that before. The issue is that Squad 22 takes real, ongoing events with documented war crimes and civilian suffering, and selectively rewrites them into something cleaner, more heroic, and more emotionally comfortable. This isn't just about how the game plays, it's about what the game wants you to remember, and what it wants you to forget. After selecting your characters and equipment, the game finally gives you your first mission and objectives. The funniest and honestly most realistic part of this game is that you're a 3-man element being ordered to assault an enemy held house, with the game making it very clear that you will receive no additional support, which is very much like the small teams Russian troops would send out to get decimated for the sole purpose of figuring out enemy positions. At the end of the mission, one of the characters reflects that their baptism by fire is over and that the war isn't like what they write about in textbooks, which is ironic because that's exactly what this game is doing, rewriting the war into something cleaner, simpler, and more glorified. After finishing the first mission, I noticed the difficulty modifier, accompanied by a pop-up claiming that the enemy regularly supplies its units with combat drugs. The game then offers an option to weaken enemies by having special forces exchange the combat drugs with laughing drugs, a thinly veiled way of framing Ukrainians as drug-fueled and irrational. You can only lower the difficulty 5 times. After that, I can only assume you need to pay for more. Anyways, when I clicked next mission, I hit a paywall. To continue playing, you're required to purchase DLC. The first DLC is the Donbass Spring, 2014. At the beginning of the Russian Ukrainian war. This was when the Russian-backed fighters launched an uprising in eastern Ukraine, covertly supported by Russian troops wearing unmarked uniforms. These soldiers became known as the Little Green Men, a fact Vladimir Putin denied for months before eventually admitting to it. In Squad 22, however, this DLC is framed as a story about a noble local militia fighting for freedom in Donbass. The next DLC covers the Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2023, which, judging by the game's framing, likely portrays Russian forces as heroic defenders of annexed Ukrainian territory. And finally, there's a locked DLC, hinting at a future release, the Battle for Avdiivka, one of the bloodiest and most destructive battles of the war so far. At first, I considered buying it out of morbid curiosity. The expansions promised drones, armored vehicles, and a richer, evolving experience. But after looking at who made this game, I quickly changed my mind because I didn't want to give my money to a developer who would use it to further aid the invasion of Ukraine. Squad 22 was developed by SPN Studio and published by Zarabana Entertainment, Russian companies whose only release project is this game. And when your debut title is a war game releasing during an active ongoing conflict, it's worth asking who it's really for and who's behind it. The game's head developer, Alexander Tolkach, studied in Moscow State Institute of International Relations, a school closely associated with Russia's diplomatic and foreign policy elite. He later worked in multiple diplomatic roles for Russia and was employed at Ukraine's largest energy company before the war, and also before a former colleague publicly accused him of being a dishonest Russian spy. More importantly, Alexander's most relevant experience isn't traditional game development at all. His background is in education and behavioral games, projects designed to shape opinions, guide behavior, and in some cases, support recruitment efforts for businesses, which makes his role here make a lot of sense. He isn't leading the project because he's a renowned game designer. He's leading it because he knows how to build games that persuade and recruit for businesses. The connections to the Russian government doesn't just stop there, with many of the game developers being connected to the military or are still in it. One of the game's consultants is Vladislav Golovin, a recipient of the Hero of Russia award, the country's highest military honor. Golovin fought Mariupol, the same battle this game portrays, before being injured by a landmine. Today, Golovin leads the all-Russian military and patriotic social movement known as the Yunarmy, a government-funded youth organization tasked with preparing teenagers for future military service. In other words, someone directly involved in recruiting young Russians to help shape a game aimed at young players. And again, this isn't subtle. Squad 22 has been showcased at Russian military expos, and its own Steam page openly states that the game is officially recommended by the Russian military as a basic infantry tactics manual for cadet and young army training. It's also been showcased at many Russian game expos, with little kids being able to play it. At that point, Squad 22 stops being just a bad game. It becomes a tool, deliberately designed, officially endorsed, and openly positioned as part of Russia's military culture. This is all a part of Russia's expansion to the soft power projection in order to change the narrative, both in Russia and abroad. At this point, you might be thinking, well, what's the issue here? Call of Duty is propaganda. The US Army literally made a game called America's Army as a recruiting tool. They basically did the same thing. And you're not wrong, kind of. But there's an important distinction. Neither Call of Duty nor America's Army were ever presented as history as is. Call of Duty takes place in a fictionalized world. Players understand that what they're experiencing is exaggerated, dramatized, and intentionally detached from real events. Even when it draws inspiration from reality, it never claims to be a factual retelling of an ongoing war, except for maybe the older Call of Duties like World at War. America's Army was also more explicit in its purpose, recruitment and basic familiarization within the military, but still didn't attempt to rewrite real-world events or provide commentary on active conflicts. It wasn't asking players to reinterpret history, it was asking them to consider enlistment. Squad 22 is different. The problem isn't that it's a bad ripoff. The problem isn't even that it functions as a recruiting tool. The problem isn't that it presents itself as historical truth while selectively erasing context, responsibility, and documented reality, all in service of an authoritarian state's preferred narrative. That's what makes this uncomfortable. This isn't about normalizing war, it's about rewriting it. Squad 22 isn't just another game used for military recruitment. It's a deliberate attempt to wash away war crimes, strip the conflict of its context, and repackage it in a way that benefits the Russian state. Games don't just entertain, they shape memory. Long after the fighting stops, they influence how wars are remembered, and when that memory is curated by the state, history doesn't just get distorted, it gets erased. It's what happens when games start presenting themselves as history as it is, while quietly deciding which parts of that history you're allowed to see and believe. But I want to hear what you think. Am I right to call this propaganda, or am I viewing this through a Western lens, and in doing so, creating propaganda of my own? Let me know in the comments, and make sure to like, subscribe, and watch my other videos about gaming and history, or for more critical Kevin complaints. Thanks for watching.